Good morning, Daniel.
Morning, Dan.
What are we talking about this week?
I want to talk about paying off debt early, the cost of delaying certain financial decisions, and smart renovations versus costly upgrades to a home.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, well, that's a very healthy list of subjects, so let's just dive right into it. What do you want to talk about first?
I want to talk about a topic that tends to spark a lot of debate amongst financial influencers and professionals, which is this idea of paying off certain debts earlier versus paying them off later because you may have a nice interest rate on them. And so, before we even get into if it's a yes or a no, what factors should somebody really be considering? Let's say it's a mortgage and they want to pay it off early. What should they consider before making this decision?
I think you want to look at what your other objectives are first, right? Your mortgage is default either a 15 or a 30-year goal, right? To go from having debt on your property to having no debt on your property. And so the question immediately emerges as a cash flow question, which is just, hey, this decision to pay off the mortgage is a decision about what to do with excess cash. And, a constructive use of it could be paying off the mortgage. But in turn, are there other goals that could go unfunded or underfunded or otherwise be delayed or made lower quality in terms of outcomes by putting more money into the mortgage? So, for example, are you ready to buy your next car? Are you ready to pay for your kids' college? Are you ready to pay for a home renovation, which I'm sure we'll talk about here in a little bit? All of those goals are potentially just as or more important than paying off the mortgage. And so there's just this immediate question of, okay, we have finite resources. Is the most optimal deployment of those resources at the present time towards this mortgage payoff goal, or is it towards other shorter term objectives that are more time sensitive because they're shorter term objectives?
All right, and you weigh your goals and whether it's a short or long term thing you're looking for here. How do you take into consideration something like the actual interest rate on the mortgage? Do you weigh that as a consideration?
Well, certainly. This is where sort of lazy napkin math comes into it, because the basic, and by the way, incorrect calculus here that anybody can do on a napkin is to just say, well, if your mortgage is 3% and you can get greater than 3% on your investments, then you should just invest and not pay off your mortgage. And that's incorrect for a number of reasons. First and foremost, if we're doing an early mortgage payoff, we're probably doing that with non retirement, non qualified money, which then means we need to factor in the tax drag of dividends and interest payments on whatever we've invested in. And then at the end of it, we're going to need this either 15% or 20% plus state tax premium above the payoff balance to actually be able to afford to do the payoff. Otherwise, we'll do the payoff and then we'll have a tax bill we can't pay. So there's an immediate requirement that we accrue more money than the actual payoff amount to attain the payoff amount if we're trying to think about this as a, well, you'd be better off investing and then paying off later versus paying off the mortgage. And that's just the net of tax calculus, let alone the rate of return problems.
What do you mean when you say rate of return problems?
That's an excellent question, Daniel. Thank you for queuing me up here. The problem that emerges is your mortgage is a fixed figure, right? It's 3%, it's 4%, it's 5%, 6%, whatever it is. And that figure won't change unless you refinance at some point during the life of the mortgage. And so, in that context, the calculation of the saved interest, right, the reduction of cost by paying off the mortgage, can be mathematically established with essentially basic algebra. And so that is easy to calculate. You can say, if I put an extra $1,000 into my mortgage every month, starting the very first month of the mortgage, I'll be paid off this much faster. I'll save myself this much in payments and interest and so on. Like, that's very empirically establishable because, again, unless you make a assumption about changes for refinances or something like that later on, that's what's going to happen. The counter offer here is to invest the money. Okay, well, once again, we have a problem, and this is where the investment thing comes in, which is we are making investments under certainty. And this idea of certainty is a problem because investments do not align to that reality. So, unless you literally go and buy something like a 30-year treasury bond, or you buy something with a perfect duration designed to line up to your exact objective, and it is so securely established in its credit worthiness that there is no uncertainty about the risks of that investment, then functionally you're making assumptions about a rate of return, and you're kind of using your best guess approach. And so the problem here is, just to make up the math here for a second, let's say you got a 20% capital gains rate you're going to have to deal with upon your liquidation all in, and let's say your mortgage is 5%. Well, then just by that basic calculus, I need to get a consistent 6% rate of return to equal out to my mortgage. I could pay my mortgage extra and guarantee myself the savings of that 5% interest not being paid on that compounding value. Conversely, if I invest, I have to get a 6% rate of return, and somebody then might pipe in here and say, well, that's not too difficult. You just be a little bit more aggressive, yada, yada. But that is an assumption. We are using probability, but probability is not certainty. Now, in shorter term increments, we could say something like, well, if you had a 3% mortgage from 2020 and a couple of years ago you could get a CD for like 5.25%, sure, the CD is going to make more sense there because we have FDIC insurance and some degree of certainty about the rate of return for the duration of that CD. And we can do the net of tax math and calculate, depending on your income tax rates, whether or not you're going to break that 3% line and if there's an arbitrage there. But as interest rates have come down and on bank rates, but mortgage rates have been high for the last several years, you don't have an easy FDIC insured guaranteed arbitrage. You have to make investments under a greater deal of risk and a greater deal of uncertainty. And that's where sequence of returns, tax drag, right, your emotional journey, right? Do you have the discipline to perfectly execute this investment strategy for, let's say, 25 years to try to then break even on paying off early and so on? All of that stuff really comes into play in a way where it's not a certainty that just by investing at a higher targeted rate of return that we're actually going to end up better than paying off the mortgage. Now, the calculus on this gets better and worse relative to how high the interest rate on the mortgage is, but that's the stuff that people tend to miss when they just do the napkin math of if target rate of return greater than mortgage, do target rate of return and invest and don't pay off the mortgage.
Okay, we work with some families who will occasionally receive an inheritance or a sum of money, and at that point in time, they will consider a decision like this, in which case there may not be those tax hits that you're talking about. If that's the case, at that point in time, does the calculus become more or less just calculating or comparing the rate of return, the investments and assumptions you make there, and comparing that to the interest rate on the mortgage?
Well, yes and no, because now we're sort of saying we're creating a kind of an after-tax hypothetical, right? So you need $400,000 to pay off your mortgage, and it just so happens you've inherited $400,000 tax-free. Cool. Okay, well, then the net of tax question no longer exists. Now the question you have to ask is, am I better off getting a guaranteed rate of return, aka interest saved in this case, of let's say 23 years at 3.5% because I have 23 years left on my mortgage and a 3.5% mortgage? Do I want to get a guaranteed interest cost savings of 3.5% compounding over 23 years? Or do I want to invest with a longer time horizon, right? Let's say 30, 40, 50 years, targeting a rate of return equal to or greater than 3.5% net of the future taxes on that. Because part of what happens here is the mortgage payoff thing happens as a limited game. There's a timeline here that we will hit at some point, also known as the 15 or 30 year duration. Whereas your general investing journey, your general wealth building journey is as long as your life expectancy. So here, then we get into another variable. Are you inheriting this money in your 30s because somebody passed away when you were younger and so it has a lot of time to grow and mature? Or are you in your 60s and your parents just passed away in their late 80s? Okay, well, now the calculus of how long we have left in the mortgage and how much money there is and so on is a little bit more important because are closer to the inevitable. And in that context, once again, we're making a decision under a greater degree of uncertainty than we were before if we had something like an expected 50 or 60-year runway to let this kind of compound and build out over time.
That's fair. So I think one of the things you want to heavily consider then is also just how long of a life you expect to live and how long you have to let that asset compound really.
Well, and something like the timing here really matters, right? Because if you do this, in year one, the value of the early payment is going to be enormous because it's going to compound out for 30 years. But we have a lot of clients who owe like 40, 50, $60,000 left on a mortgage and they're like 27 years into it. And the question will be there like, hey, should we just pay this off? And it's like, nah, like you're paying like $900 a month, and that was a big amount of money when you started, 20 plus years ago. But today it's less than most people's like monthly property tax cost, or most people's, actual just like P&I before they even get into insurance and so on. Like, sure, it'd be nice to get rid of that bill, but like the value of inflation has steadily decreased the cost of that bill over time. Whereas if you were buying your same house today, you'd be paying $4,000 a month. So, like, to some extent, even though you could quote unquote save money by making an early payment and saving yourself the interest and so on, so much of your payment is going to principal already, and the actual dollar value you're paying for your expense for the mortgage is now so inflated over time. And inflation here, for the reference, is a good thing, right? Because the dollar value is now lower. That functionally, why bother paying it off early? Like, it's costing you next to nothing relative to what it cost you 25, 26, 27 years ago.
I think one of the interesting things about the mortgage or just debt in general is how some people feel towards it. We work with some folks who they're cool. Hey, look, I have a 2.5% mortgage. I have a fixed rate I pay per month, and I understand it's technically a liability against my net worth, but I understand the arbitrage and how things are working in my favor in that regard. But then there's other people we work with and speak to who see it as such a handicap or a burden, it not only financially, but emotionally and psychologically. They don't enjoy carrying debt. How do we weigh in those factors, from an emotional perspective when making these decisions? Because I know we can run the numbers and say what's financially optimal, but some people genuinely breathe and sleep easier when they don't have something like a mortgage.
Well, and therein, I think it's the stress premium. Stress has a number of health impacts, quality of life impacts, and so on. And so, from that particular standpoint, the question we just want to ask is, hey, are you like me? Are you a Dan Yerger, and having debt does not stress you out in the slightest because you're very comfortable with the math and the figures? Or are you a nervous Nelly? Not to be negative about it at all, but are you the type of person who just having debt just absolutely stresses you out? It grates on you. You look at it constantly. It terrifies you that you could, lose your job and not be able to pay your mortgage and lose your house. Like, all those various things just weigh on you constantly. I think depending on where you live on the spectrum between those two extremes, you just have to then discount for it appropriately, right? If you're in my camp, it doesn't matter at all. If you're in that far extreme camp, paying off the debt is worth the psychological premium to you. And it may not be financially optimal, but we say it over and over again, money is permission. And if you want to spend your extra permission on being debt free so you can sleep better at night, that's well worth the investment. I think the question is more challenging if you're somewhere in the continuum between those points, and you're maybe kind of logically saying, well, it doesn't make sense to pay off my mortgage early because I've got a great rate, but I'd feel really good about it. And you just have to think, and really look at, is this impacting my quality of life? Is this harming the decisions I'm able to make in my day to day life, or causing me undue financial anxiety or stress? I think if that is the case, then the value of making that payoff does increase, even if it's not financially optimal.
Mm. Yeah, I like to say the financially optimal decision is not always the optimal lifestyle decision. And if you can find a healthy balance between the two and potentially uh, pay off the mortgage and it makes you feel better on a day to day basis and can afford it, sometimes it might be worth it. Are there other good debts that people can evaluate potentially paying off or might make more sense just keeping for the duration of the loan?
I think anything south of about 7 or 8% is worth thinking about keeping longer term, just because there's potentially more cash flow arbitrage and value in kind of the flexibility premium. So I'm thinking about things like student loans, auto loans, things that are not going to be necessarily lifelong or cost you an infinite amount of money, but also the cost of the financing isn't so extreme that you're just accruing debt endlessly. I think when you get to things like credit cards or variable rate loans, then you're probably in the territory where we do just want to get this stuff zeroed out, because there's almost no world in which we're going to invest to make up the difference. But for something like student loans in particular, I look at something like public student loan forgiveness, or even just 20-year, 25-year repayee forgiveness, and go, hey, like, look, there's a world in which if you have enough debt, it's going to make more sense to just service the debt for 20 or 25 years and let it go away, than it is to try to actually get it paid down faster. Because even if the rate is, let's say, 6.5, 7.5%, like it's high, but it's not so high that it's unmanageable, and forgiveness is going to be cheaper than getting it paid off in a lot of cases.
Makes sense to me.
I think there's also just a fun joke in here, which you sort of invoke in terms of the financially optimal decision is not always the right decision, and the joke just that I got a giggle out of it the other week, so I'm going to share it here. But somebody just made the comment of Warren Buffett was a terrible investor. Dude was working into his 90s before he could retire.
Oh, he's finally stepping away, though. I think he's finally has his enough.
Yeah, and I think in that regard, I think he probably had his enough a long time ago. But whether it was financially optimal or life optimal, the man was happy to work into his 90s, and more power to him.
So, transitioning here a little bit, I want to talk about the cost of delaying certain financial decisions. I think it's something we hear a lot. It's somebody comes to us, they're 40, 50, 60, and they say, wow, I wish we had started this 10 years ago. And I always like to say, the best time to plant an apple tree was 10 years ago, but the good news is the second best time is today. And I think we kind of feel it emotionally for our clients. It's this feeling of, wow, we should have done this earlier, or even somebody who may want to work with us continuing to put certain recommendations or items off. And, as people who work in this every day, we can sometimes struggle to understand why they may be doing that. And I wanted to kind of talk about it a little bit because for us, it makes sense. This will increase your net worth by X if you do it today. Do it today. But it's easier said than done. And a lot of people don't do that. Why do you think some people delay important decisions that they know they should pursue earlier than later?
So there's actually a really good academic theory for this, which is the behavioral life cycle hypothesis, which followed the original life cycle hypothesis. And the original life cycle hypothesis essentially sort of posited that everybody in their lifetime has a certain level of consumption that they will default to. And it's sort of a magical, invisible number. Like if you think of yourself as a person who's going to be a lawyer and then is a lawyer and then is going to make lawyer money and have a lawyer career, there's a certain quality of life. And if you think of yourself as a person who works at the grocery store, you're going to have a different quality of life, so on and so forth. And that our consumption tends to be relatively consistent over a lifetime. And that in that context, then we can sort of naturally intuit what's appropriate levels of consumption for us based on our career and life expectations. And of course, you and I can think of a million problems with that, which is why the behavioral life cycle hypothesis exists. And what that really points at is that people try to smooth their consumption out over time. And consumption is an interesting word here because it sort of has negative connotations. We think of like overspending or indulging or something, but in the economic sense, consumption is just all the money you spend. So it can be the money you spend on taxes, on your home, on your childcare, on your college, on your groceries, on your vacations, everything. And in that sense, people engage in periodic dissaving, which is the academic term for essentially borrowing money or spending money you don't have, or otherwise decumulating wealth in order to smooth over periods where their income does not necessarily support their consumption behaviors because they're trying to maintain a certain sort of psychological quality of life. So that you hear stories about people who lose their jobs and don't change their behavior at all. And that's because they have a hard time dealing with the financial anxiety of cutting back, of budgeting, of being more cautious with their money, and so on. And that doesn't apply to everybody. Some people will absolutely pull back because they have a more frugal lifestyle or flexible lifestyle. But in that context, to your question, I think the heart of the issue is that even though you and I as financial planners understand that time value of money is like the property of physics, it is the grammar of the language of finance to think about everything in present value and future value and to account for the change in value over time. Human beings cannot make all of their financially responsible decisions at a fixed point in time, or if they do, it's a very extreme event to say, like, I am going to deliberately save this aggressively my whole life and I'm going to make all the positive financial decisions on day one, and I'm never going to differentiate or deviate at any time. I think most people sort of have to do the whole how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time approach to their finances, which is like, okay, today I can handle fixing my portfolio. I'm going to sit down with Daniel here, and he is going to give me advice and guidance on how to allocate my 401k. I can do that. And then, next week he's going to ask me to look at my homeowners, my auto policies, and he's going to point out that there's maybe some lack of coverage here or that I'm paying too much. And I can deal with looking at a quote or two to try to fix that problem a little bit later. And, I know earlier when Daniel helped me with this planning conversation, he told me that I need to save $831 for my kids' college if they want to go to CU Boulder in 18 years. But like, God, that's just so much money out of my paycheck. I feel like I'm going to be able to stomach that dollar amount better 2 or 3 years from now after I think I'm going to get my next promotion and raise. It's like there's just sort of this rationalization thing where all the financial behaviors could potentially be affordable today and manageable today, but it's just sort of overwhelming to try to do it all at once. And I think that's part of our role as financial planners is to just consistently advocate for the right financial behaviors to help you arrive at the right financial outcomes.
No, I think it's something we see all the time. We had a client come in a couple months ago, and they had worked with a planner in the past. One of the reasons they stopped working with them is they said they just overwhelmed us. They gave us this list of everything that we needed to do, and the expectation, while it wasn't articulated, was essentially we're going to get this done as quickly as possible. So, what did the client do with that old advisor instead of taking actionable advice on all the things they were provided? They did nothing. Uh, Conversely, we're working with them now, and it's important to recognize their tempo and the speed at which they can implement and digest advice, and starting to say, okay, well, we can build momentum over time. We're going to do small, actionable changes as opposed to large, extensive overhauls that are just going to completely overwhelm you. Even for me, like a example that has nothing to do with finance, running in a 10K in Boulder in about 2 weeks here. I despise running. I used to run when I wrestled in high school, and I have just a very negative association with anything that requires jogging because it just reminds me of having to lose weight for wrestling. And that's about 6.2 miles, I believe. So what I did is about a month and a half out, maybe a month out, ran half a mile and said, that's not 6.2 miles. It's not even close. But I ran today, and I'll do the same tomorrow. I ran half a mile the next day. And over time, incrementally, I've been able to build up to a point where I'm now much closer to the actual 10K distance because I used kind of the same recommendations that we give clients, which is we'll do something small today that won't overwhelm you, as opposed to just trying to do everything all at once. And instead, if I had ran 5 miles that first day, probably would have been so sore and so miserable, I wouldn't have ran for another week.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and you bring up this example of the client who had a financial planner already and who just sort of gave them everything, and it reminds me of the joke or the sort of I don't know what you'd call it, idiom, whatever it would be, of the little girl talking to her mom and saying, "I want to be a doctor," and the mom goes, "Well, honey, you're going to have to go to undergrad, and you're going to have to go to medical school and do a residency. It's a lot of work to be a doctor." And the little girl goes, "Yeah, but mommy, that's just three things." It's easy for us as planners to sort of have the, well, look, like here's the checklist of all the things you need to do to improve your finances. It's just 19 things, and if we can do it, we could physically do them all today. You just have to do it. Super easy. And it's easy for us to fall into that. And the trick there is that everybody has a different level of executive functioning, of motivation, of comfort, right? Just because we can do the math and show the recommendation doesn't mean people have reached the state of psychological confidence to implement everything on day one. And so it's an interesting experience. It's, I think, a fun debate that financial planners have where we often like to argue about how we get paid. And I'm not going to ramble on that too much, but a lot of that often, I think, invisibly revolves around a substantial difference in philosophy of how much work it takes to get something done, or whether it's actually the financial planner's responsibility to get anything done versus just telling the person, here's what you need to do. I think it's a really interesting piece of human psychology that, yeah, functionally, all you have to do to be fit is eat right and exercise. Done. Except for all the times we don't eat right and all the times we don't exercise. And to your point of getting ready to run the Boulder in 2 weeks, it's that thing where you recognize that if you just tried to run 6.2 miles, right out of the gate, you might physically be able to do it, but it's going to be pretty miserable. And so by spacing that objective out over time, it's doing you a lot of favors, not only in your physical preparation, but also your psychological acceptance of the task.
I appreciate you saying you think I'd be able to potentially do it, but you are considerably overestimating my stamina. But uh, quick question there. Uh, So would you say, our job as financial planners, right, is to help clients implement actionable advice and see it through? But the question, I guess, there is, would you say it's better as a planner and in a client relationship to get to a point where things are quote unquote good enough as opposed to perfect, but later?
I'm absolutely in the good enough category rather than the perfect. As sort of the old expression goes, perfect is the enemy of good. I think you can absolutely engage in analysis paralysis. I remember I had a client years ago who essentially didn't want us to manage their money, which was fine. But then she engaged in what I'll call investment management by 20 questions. I think I got something like 55 emails in a 1 month period, just picking the nit and then picking the nit and then picking the nit on what am I going to invest in here, and then when I invest in that, should I do a little bit more here, a little bit more there, and then given the answer, well, but why wouldn't I want to do it this way? And then okay, I saw your feedback and I haven't done it yet, but now I have new questions that I want to do in tandem, and so month after month after month, this person is just drenching me in emails, one or two emails a day, and never actually implementing, never actually getting it done because she didn't want to invest in the wrong thing. She wanted to invest in the perfect thing. And I think by the end of it, by the time I finally said, like, look, we have discussed this to death. You just need to do it. I don't think she ever got around to doing it. And that's a problem because there's a different world here where whether we manage it or not, there's a lot of clients who just say, "What should I invest in?" We say, "Invest in that." They go, "Great," they do it, done. And maybe it's not perfect. Maybe it wouldn't have been as perfectly tuned and tailored to this exact individual in the exact way they wanted to, but how much was the opportunity cost of trying to get it perfectly? Same thing on insurance, same thing on estate planning, same thing on budgeting. Like, we would love to have this rip a band-aid off to it perfectly philosophy, but it's not very practical. But in turn, waiting for things to be perfect, unfortunately, plans never survive reality or contact with reality. And so the idea that we're going to wait until it's perfect is just sort of a fool's errand, I think, in many regards. At the end of the day, we want to make incremental improvements that aggregate to a greater sum.
So while we can push clients to make incremental improvements, whether it's me or you as a planner, or maybe it's somebody trying to get a parent to be more fiscally responsible or a child, how do you help them start to recognize this paralysis and build the urgency to overcome it besides just making small steps?
You see, it's interesting to say besides making small steps, but the challenge there is not necessarily that there's a different way to implement it. Maybe it's the question of the frequency of the steps or the size of the steps, right? What defines small, for example? But I think it is getting to an agreement about a consistent tempo and not having it be an act of willpower to take a step every time. So it's better to say, look, we're going to take a 1% improvement or 1% completion on this. We're going to do it every week, which means it's going to take us, over a year to get to 100%. But if we can agree to work with each other 1% a week at a time consistently for the next year and change, we will get there. Alternatively, if it is, hey, we're going to do this in 25% chunks, but you're going to have to just like absolutely get jazzed and amped and make time for it and really just focus and get your attention on it, and it takes an enormous amount of energy to get there, then the probability that we actually ever succeed in completing this is much, much lower. It is, good financial planning is not the creation of a financial plan. It is the active iteration. It is the process of assessing where we are, where we're trying to go, and making the motions to get there. And so, in that particular regard to your question, I think at the end of the day, it's about agreeing to how we're going to make progress and having the mutual respect between you and that third party about how you're going to help them get there, whether it's advising, whether it's holding their hand, whether it's just checking on them, but then also, acknowledging when there's been a deviation from the agreement and holding each other accountable to make sure that it's actually fulfilled.
Excellent. Thanks. So, last topic here. Uh, Smart renovations to a home versus just costly upgrades. I think it's another one in regards to homes we see a lot in both my personal life and in my professional life. I call it the renovation hamster wheel. Somebody will redo the tiles in the bathroom, but now that they redid the tiles in the master bathroom, all the other bathrooms need to be renovated. And now that all the bathrooms have been renovated, well, the kitchen, I can't leave the kitchen out. And then since the kitchen's been upgraded, the basement, we need to do it all. Um, and I think a lot of times people will justify these renovations by saying, well, it's going to increase the value of the home. In theory, I put amount in today, but it's going to generate 10x or 5x for me if and when I decide to sell the home. And I think sometimes that's true, and sometimes people can just, you know, believe it even if it really isn't true. So I wanted to think about it today here. What home improvements first and foremost actually do increase the value of the home?
I'm gonna sort of pull out a thing here, which is there's that expression, right? Comparison is the thief of joy, and my corollary to that is home renovations is the thief of your financial well-being. And I say that because there's almost no positive ROI on almost anything you could do to a house in micro bites. Now, this is different than, let's say, house flipping, right? Where somebody buys a complete teardown of a house and modernizes it and makes it acceptable for modern living. That's a different scenario. But I'm talking about sort of what you described, the incremental, well, I don't like this bathroom, I'm going to fix it. And then now that I have one really nice bathroom in my house, I really now, by comparison, hate the other bathrooms and feel more and more pressure to do something about those. And the problem is that generally speaking, you're not going to get a dollar for dollar return on those renovations. And you're almost certainly not going to get a premium return on those renovations just from a financial standpoint, let alone then the impact to your quality of life to have contractors or somebody, redoing your kitchen, redoing your bathroom. Um, I think there's an interesting thing that helps with this, which is to think of your home in its individual components more so than as the aggregation of the emotional weight that you give to the identity of your home.
What do you mean by that?
So think of something like your kitchen. Okay, kitchen renovation, cheap end, 5% of the home value, luxury end, 20% of the home value. Where the kitchen is this central, very important space in your house, and it provides very obvious, important functions like the storage and preparation of food. But in that sense, what your kitchen actually is, when you break it down, it is a series of boxes or platforms that hold things like dishes, pots, pans, etc. It is perhaps a container, aka a cupboard or pantry, that holds food. It is a cold metal box that holds food. It is one or two large appliance devices that either heats food up or otherwise cleans dishes, and it is a source of water. And when you break it into those individual components, and I ask you, how much would you pay for a source of water? You probably don't think to yourself, like, well, I'd pay, $20,000 for a source of water. But you can spend $20,000 on a custom sink setup. If I say, would you pay $5,000 for a wooden box? Probably not, because you probably immediately think, well, how much is plywood? Like, come on, it's just a box. But people will pay several $1,000s per cabinet across a series of nice matching cabinets. How much would you pay for the metal box that keeps your food cold, right? A refrigerator. You can get a refrigerator for a couple $100, but people will spend thousands of dollars on it. So I elucidate this as sort of the individual components because it's the aggregate emotional thing we're buying. We walk into our kitchen and we go, it just doesn't look the way I want it to, or it's a little small, it's a little tight, or it just feels dated. But the functionality of that space is not going to change if you spend 10% of your net worth making it really nice and modern or pretty. Same thing for your bathroom. Break it into its individual components. It's a source of water. It's a place to get rid of waste. It's a place to clean yourself. Okay. And again, in individual components here, how much would you pay for a source of water? Not $10,000, $15,000, but people will, right? How much do you think a toilet is worth? Not that much, but people spend a couple $1,000s to get a different toilet put in place, right? How much is it worth to run water over your body or sit in a pool of water with some soap and shampoo? It's worth something, but again, is it worth 10, 15, $20,000? Probably not. But we build up this emotional story around the space we live in. Not to ramble here too long, but there's an interesting conversation that I had with a client just in the past week. He and his wife have had this on and off conversation about like, do we are we in our forever home or do we want a bigger, nicer, better forever home? And this has been a going conversation for years and years. And they finally came to me last week and said, "Hey, we think we've identified our forever home, but we've run the math on it, how much it's going to cost, what it's going to do, yada yada, and we're kind of worried about like, is this the right decision for us?" And I said, "Look, you currently have financial bandwidth. The cost of this new home is going to eat up that bandwidth, just to be clear. That's okay. But now what you're making a decision about for yourself and your family is the importance of your home and making the memories and having the experiences that you want to spend that permission on versus staying in your current home and having Disney experiences or having plane ticket experiences or having nice trip out experiences. In the future, you'll make more money, you'll grow your income, and those will be more viable, but you're essentially deciding to put kind of all your life experiential eggs in one particular big nice house basket versus individual experience basket. And their final decision was, yep, that's what we want to do. And that's a powerful decision for themselves. But what they're actually purchasing in this process is a couple more rooms, a slightly different location, a slightly bigger like yard and space, and otherwise in the individual components, more or less, it's the same thing they had before. And that's meaningful and important to them. But that is the aggregated decision, not a decision based on the literal value of having, let's say, 600 more square feet.
Okay, so seems like the general idea here is when you break it down, a lot of these renovations, if not all of them, actually do not it materially increase the value at all. Let me give you an example, and I want to see if this does. You said that home flipping is a little different, but let's say you just live in a home that you've owned for a handful of years and everything is old, right? So not eh, not serviceable, right? Things everything works, but it's old, and you want to sell the home and you want to prep it for sale. If you were at that point to put say 40, 50 grand into it, and now it's no longer an old home on the interior and everything's brand new and looks modern as opposed to old and outdated, can that in theory raise the value of the home and justify selling it at a higher cost?
I think so, but in this, we're really thinking actually more about cosmetic items and not material items. So, like you gave out, like, 40, $50,000. Imagine, let's say, a 1960s house built here in Longmont, 3 bed, 2 bath. It's got that layout where the kitchen's right past the front door and the living room's off to the right or the left, and there's sort of a split level design going up and down. There's like 10,000 of these houses in Longmont. That house is going to be improved in the sale process with a fresh coat of paint, maybe a fixture touch up here or there, staging certainly to help people sort of envision it as theirs, right? The classic mistake people make when they want to sell their house is that they're still living in it, because then people have a hard time envisioning themselves in the house. I think those cosmetic factors can be really beneficial in creating an ROI. Same thing with like a little bit of yard work, landscaping, etc. But I don't think, for example, you're really going to make your money back if you dump $50,000 into updating the kitchen. I think you'll get your $50,000 back. I don't think you're going to be able to sell the house for an extra 100, 150, 200,000. Because you also have to think about who's trying to buy that old house versus who's trying to buy an updated new house. The person who wants to buy the old house might be lower income. Maybe this might be the only kind of house they can afford, and so they'd like nicer features, but they can't afford nicer features. It might be somebody who wants to flip the house, right? They're going to put the money and capital into it, and so if you do some little touch ups here and there, they're going to be like, "Well, thanks for that, but like, meh." I'm going to do my own thing, and because I have a certain design philosophy I want to use to maximize the value in the home. So I think there's lots of little touch up things you can do to improve a house, and I do think you can make your money back from certain renovations and updates. But again, I think to your question, there's a particular form there where you said if you put 40 or $50,000 into the house, I think to really get your bang for the buck, you probably are going to have to put like $150,000 into a house like that to really improve the sale price. And then again, we still have to circle around to who are we trying to sell to, and is it worth the time, energy, hassle that comes with that? Now, if your house is a death trap, that's a different conversation. But if it's just, yeah, we never updated the kitchen, all the bathrooms are original, etc., there's an audience for that house. You don't have to do a lot of work and incur a lot of cost and risk by doing so to then sell that house for a perfectly reasonable premium. Because I think when you put in, $10,000 worth of work, I don't think you're going to magically turn that into $20,000 in a lot of cases.
I think also, I think people think that they're getting an ROI on renovations because they struggle to delineate between just the real estate market and the appreciation and what people will pay for the home as opposed to what people will pay because you renovated something. So they may put 10, $15,000 into something and say, well, I got $1 million for the house. Clearly it paid off. When in reality, it's like, well, they were willing to pay that anyways, regardless of the renovations, because that's what the market was, you know, willing to offer. And that's what people are willing to pay for the home.
And here's a good example where sometimes there's going to be a fringe case that proves me wrong here. And I can think of one particular one. When my wife and I were looking at buying a house in 2021, bearing in mind we and everybody else had just spent the last year staring at the walls of their old house or their old home going, ugh, I hate this. I want something new. There was a house put up for sale here in Longmont. It was a tri-level house, so garden level sort of downstairs, kind of 1.5 story upstairs. You walked in the front. This is again a house that's all over Longmont. You walk in and there's a staircase in front of you that goes down and one that goes up, and that's sort of how you split the house up. And like the kitchen and bedrooms are upstairs, and there's sort of like living room, den, bathroom downstairs. It was in the northwest side of Longmont. I think this house was probably regular, like retail value, probably worth like $400,000 to $420,000. But the people who lived in the house were artists. And so their house was decorated beautifully. Their furniture was beautiful. They had all this original stuff in it. The backyard was very well custom built out and well done, so on and so forth. So it was just a beautiful, perfect demonstration of this house. And I think this house sold for something like $170,000 over asking. Bearing in mind, again, the time was a little bit extreme, but I think probably the person who bought that house, I would almost guarantee, had enormous buyer's remorse afterwards. Because when those people moved out and took their beautiful furniture and took their beautiful art and took all the things that kind of gussied it up and made it really like a beautiful, well lived in space, I'm going to bet that they suddenly realized that they had bought kind of an older mid century wooden box that without all that beautiful stuff in, they probably wouldn't have paid more than 500 for, even in the current environment. And so there is something to aesthetic improvements and things that sort of help story tell and create a vision of a beautiful space that can really improve the value. But like nothing in that house had been renovated or updated. It was all original. But they just happened to have put beautiful things in it that sort of could tease your brain into thinking it was worth more than it was.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about how we can make it an emotional purchase and tie emotions to it as opposed to looking at it objectively and as single objects and rooms where this is a box, it's where we store our pots and pans, this is where we sleep, right? And these folks that purchased the home probably said, no, well, it's this beautiful room with look at all these features and things that are in it, and they envision themselves in it and are willing to pay more because of that.
There it is. Well, Daniel, have I answered all of your renovation questions and ruined any possibility that you'll ever update a bathroom or redo a kitchen?
Well, considering I rent, not a lot I can do in that regard right now, anyways.
You can always just rent a nicer bathroom.
Well, I think that's more than enough for today. I appreciate it.
Sure. Well, then I'll ask the question as always. What have you learned in the last couple of weeks you want to share with the audience?
So we're doing this EOS project as a team here, and one of the things that's been challenging for me is in order to kind of think about the firm where we see ourselves in 5, 10, 20 years, is you almost have to also think about where you see yourself in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And it's made me realize whether for business planning or just as an individual trying to plan your life, if you want a certain life, there are certain steps obviously that you have to take, but the future doesn't kind of get planned by itself. What you do plan is where you want to go, envision what that ideal scenario looks like, and then instead reverse engineer how you're going to plan your actions today in the next year to create that future that you intend on building. I think a lot of people do it backwards, where they say, I'm just going to put my head down, earn a good living today, and we'll see if I'm able to do X in 10, 15, 20 years. As opposed to reverse engineering and asking yourself, exactly what does my ideal future in 5, 10 years look like? I have a kid, I got the dog, the white picket fence. Okay, great. What do you have to do in the next year, 5 years, 10 years, in order for that to actually become a reality? And I think that's something we can use for all of our goals, whether it's I want to get in shape for a year or in a year. I want to be able to go on this vacation in 5 years, or I want to purchase this home. It's like, okay, well, how much is that going to cost? And how can we reverse engineer into today what actions we actually need to take? And it kind of goes back to earlier when we said small actionable steps and doing good as opposed to perfect tomorrow. What little step and incremental improvement can you make today toward the goal, as opposed to putting it off and doing something tomorrow? And I think it's universal for a lot of goals.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.